You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. It's good to see you, Mike and Geoff. Geoff, did you catch Mike slagging us for taking too much holiday?
I decided to just let that go by. I think it was well meant. It's in fun, wasn't it? Right, Mike? Right?
I missed you guys. I missed you.
Well, thanks for handling that.
Geoff, how were the little birdies on your little birdie island?
There were fewer than we thought, but that's a longer conversation. Yeah.
Well, and nothing happened while we were gone, right? Like it was sleepy times in BC politics. So,
you know what I forgot? I forgot to bring my present for you, Kate, that I got at the P&E for you. So next week I'll try to remember.
What? I need to hear more about this.
I got a present for you.
Okay. This is like an Easter egg for next week's listeners.
3-foot high stuffed bear, probably.
Ooh, actually, that would go down well in my household. All right. Well, today's an interesting episode. Today, we're going to head over to the Hurly Burly.
That should be fun. See our old friend David.
Good to see David. Yeah. And I think we've got a little bit of an announcement, Mike, we're going to make.
Yeah, there's going to be, stick around for our show with David Herle today in a few minutes, because there's going to be an announcement about our election coverage for Hotel Pacifico. It's going to require some early mornings, Kate and Geoff. We're going to have to be up at the crack of dawn.
Be very
I promise.
Are you ready for it?
I'm going to show up in pajamas. Like you're literally going to get me rolling out of bed.
Okay, that's not a bad idea. And
it's a podcast.
You'll probably see my cat as well. My cat won't be joining me because I'll be broadcasting from home.
There you
go.
But
we won't say too much. Stick around for the special announcement.
Stick around for it. But yeah, it's just been such a big week in BC politics that our colleagues over at the Hurly Burly wanted us all to get together with David and do a deep dive on what's been going on and what's coming in BC politics. So let's head over and go say hi to David.
All right, a huge welcome to all of you curiouser and curiouser Hurly Burlyites. We've got a fantastic show today. So excited. That's because it's a special crossover with our excellent air quotes media sister pod out in BC. And so, with as much goddamned Hurly hospitality as I can dredge up, here in my new temporary role as junior trainee night manager of Hotel Pacifico, I welcome all of you long-term guests of the hotel. We've got an election coming up in BC. Writ days in about 2.5 weeks, September 21. If you've been following along on Hotel Pacifico, the Curse of Politics, and the Hurly Burly, you know a hell of a lot's happened already. Falcon is the newest verb in the English language. As in, hey there, you once dominant party in the BC political landscape, you just got falconed. You can bet the election period is going to be packed with similar drama, and you don't have to miss 1 second of it. Air Quotes Media is chuffed to announce that Hotel Pacifico is going daily during the entire election period. 18 episodes, Monday to Friday, released at 9 a.m. Pacific time. All the latest developments, analysis, polling, and advertising reviews delivered every morning, like coffee in a croissant-like object, fresh to your hotel room door. My guests today are the fantastic Hotel Pacifico hosts, and we're going to set the entire BC election scene for you. Mike McDonald, longtime political strategist, pollster, and former chief of staff to Premier Christy Clark. Globe and Mail and New York Times journalist Kate Hammer. And Geoff Meggs, former chief of staff to Premier Horgan and current comms strategist. Welcome to the Hurly Burly, folks. Thank you for doing this.
Good to see you.
Yes. David, I want to wish you a happy anniversary. Happy 40th anniversary of the day you were covered in your own blood.
I consider this the anniversary of the day John Turner won Vancouver Quadra. That's
another good way to put it. Yeah.
Did anything else happen that day? I forget. I don't know.
For our listeners, the 1984 election was this day which there was a historic landslide defeat for the Liberals, of which David and I were then young pups.
Yep. Didn't know
Mike
quite
McDonald,
what it
is. Out of the gate with a 4-decade-old political reference.
Hey,
I love
it's an historic day.
True to form.
We learned humility early.
And Jesus, Mike, we didn't know if the Liberal Party would survive. What do you think about that, eh?
Well, they certainly did better than BC United.
That's what I'm going to say. Okay, so let's get into this. So we now have had some polls that come out subsequent to the BC United withdrawal from the race. And so we've seen what the head-to-heads look like. Mike, can you start us off? What is the overall situation right now?
Well, I think it's pretty close to a dead heat in terms of the public polls. That's a trend that's been carrying on all summer. The Conservatives have been inching closer and closer. And I'm not actually sure the collapse of BC United has led to an increase in BC Conservative support. I think, in fact, what was left to BC United at the end of the day was a lot of federal Liberals and remaining federal Conservatives, and they're probably a wash as to which way they go. But what the difference is now is that there's one less party on the ballot in the debate, one less party to attack the Conservatives during the election. So I think there are tactical advantages for the Conservatives that were gained out of this deal that was done, notwithstanding there potentially a momentum bump as well in terms of the horse race.
Right.
But it might be good to point out, I was going to jump on that, David, just say, like, it might be good to point out for listeners elsewhere in the country, like how different this is from a year ago, right? Because, like earlier this year in early 2024, it looked like David Eby had kind of taken on the reins of the BC NDP from a very popular John Horgan pretty seamlessly. And he was kind of out and moving and really kind of getting shit done. And even though the polls did show that voters were kind of cranky, like it wasn't sticking to him. He looked kind of like that. He had that Teflon man vibe going. And so just to put it in perspective, we're now kind of 9 months later in a completely different place where it's a dead heat in the polls, and the momentum's really with the Conservatives, who 2 years ago were like one guy who got kicked out of his party.
Right.
But I would say that a year ago was more of the outlier scenario, and historically in BC, it's been a two-party race with a couple of leftovers on the side. And what has been missed a lot in the current conversation is that David Eby's numbers have not deteriorated as much as you would think for someone who was new to the Premier League, was finding his feet on a whole bunch of difficult files. He's had some missteps and had to recover. But Kevin Falcon barely put a chip in his windshield during that entire period. And part of the frustration on the other side was that it just wasn't working. People weren't liking Kevin Falcon, and they were completely done with the formation that was called the BC Liberals. They were completely done with it, and he was very much yesterday's man. I like Herle's comment off the top about being falconed. It's like doing a falcon. You have to go a long way back globally, maybe in the annals of politics, to find political treachery at the scale of Kevin Falcon's. I think a reporter here, Keith Baldry, said he's heard of caucuses pushing their leader off the cliff, but he's never heard of a leader pushing the caucus off the cliff. And I just want to stop on this for a minute because I happened to be in Toronto when this broke, and Mike did a brilliant emergency podcast, but I wasn't able to participate. What Falcon did needs to be broken down a little bit without telling anybody in his group over a weekend where he continued to campaign and slag the Conservatives relentlessly. He sent a secret emissary, his sister-in-law, to reach out to Conservative operatives and handed them the crown jewels of the BC Conservatives opposition research, or BC United's opposition research, which was basically the keys to the realm, And after that, they started to work out how they would then slaughter the leftovers of BC United. He didn't meet with his caucus. He barely met with his executive. People like Shirley Bond heard about it on the phone. So people in the rest of Canada shouldn't believe the guff that's coming from some quarters that Kevin Falcon had a kind of statesperson-like moment and decided to do the right thing for all the good people.
Joe Biden.
Yeah, no, none of that. Something happened to Falcon in the last week, which had not happened up to then, which is that he decided to take the direction of people who've been beating on him mercilessly to unite the right. He gave it one shot earlier in the year. It was a misapprehension of what he was where he really stood. He overplayed his hand, and Rustad just told him to get lost. But Rustad was always going to do that. Rustad had already been fired by Falcon. He already had a bit of a show going, and so what Falcon did was he basically built a bomb. He went to the basement and he blew BC United to smithereens, destroyed the candidacies of all of those candidates, and I just think I needed to say that and get it off my chest. It's really disgraceful.
Fair enough, but he had no pathway. There was no pathway.
Right.
Well, and he has salvaged a few things out of what he's done. Had a deal been done
name
6
one.
months ago, he would
Literally a
have
few.
had a lot more leverage if this had happened 6 or 9 months ago. But
Well, I guess
he's
I'm kind of old
almost no
school. Like,
leverage.
I think if you lead a party, you say we've got certain principles, we're there for the voters to give them an option. You should let them have the option. He could have resigned.
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Geoff is saying, but I think it's interesting how angry Geoff is about it. And so it's I
am touched by the genuine outpouring of concern for former BC Liberals that has been.
So it leads to my next question.
Forward.
Leads to my next question. I will stick with you, Geoff, which is, so now we have a head-to-head showdown. However we got there, whatever skullduggery was involved, now we have a head-to-head showdown. The NDP don't usually win those in BC. Why would that be different this time?
Well, I think that Mike made an important point. It's not a straight arithmetic business. We'd been in sort of a dead heat for several polls before Falcon blew himself to pieces, along with everybody with him. The NDP team is in strong shape. I think there's some things that our side could do that would strengthen our hand more. One is to point to the really strong front bench there, which represents a whole generational renewal. People like who won't be familiar to the rest of the Canadians, but Ravi Kahlon, Housing Minister Nikki Sharma, the AG, Josie Osborne, Energy. There's a whole fleet of very experienced front benchers in that NDP team. The NDP team is fully funded, and it's been preparing for a year or 2 years now for this race, whereas the opponents are today still phoning people saying, I know you thought you were running. You seem like a lovely person. Get lost. We shouldn't underestimate it. Of course, there's a lot of momentum there. We'll see how Rustad did. Thanks to Falcon, he was able to lose the candidate who a week ago he was defending. She insisted that cell phones are a genocidal weapon, a genocidal machine. And John Rustad said, I'm not going to dump her. That's cancel culture. She's gone this week. But, these were the kinds of people that Kevin Falcon was looking at and saying, is this who I'm supposed to unite with? And so they're going through that vetting process now.
Yeah.
Late timing, but maybe they'll make it.
Can I jump on that, Geoff? Can I offer two other possible reasons to feel this might be more favorable for the NDP? And say one is that, and over the weekend, the BC Conservatives have been sort of figuring out the map and figuring out where they're bringing in BC United candidates and dumping their own. And there's still a couple places where, and we certainly have probably two BC United candidates or sitting MLAs who are pissed, don't see themselves in the BC Conservative tent. They see it as too far right, who may run as independent. So there's a couple ridings like that might get futzed with in a close election that can be really important. The other thing that's weird this time around is the coalition behind the NDP and the demographics of it is a bit different than what it's been historically. And namely, it's older voters that seem to be sticking with the NDP. And the folks who are moving to the Conservatives are predominantly young men. And so you've got the voter turnout advantage with the older voters. So I'll add to what Geoff said and offer, this is a weird election.
Right. Okay, so let's break it down for listeners that don't know BC all that well. Let's do a little blocking and tackling here. So, Mike, let's start with you. And let's say I looked at the 338 projections for BC based on the most recent polling. And they can't tell what the result of the election is going to be. And they can't even really tell whether it's going to be close or not. They think it's going to be close and popular vote, but the seat count range is enormous between what it could be, which means there's a ton of close ridings, a ton of close fights out there. What are the battlegrounds? Where should people be looking? What parts of the province will determine this race?
Let me give you a shorthand on how the Conservatives might win, and the reverse. That's the mirror image of the NDP, I guess. If they come charging out of the interior of the province where there's 25 seats, and they win 20, which Christy Clark was able to do, then they got 20. And then they run the table all the way to the Surrey border in the Fraser Valley, which BC Liberals historically did. That's 28 seats. They win a majority of seats in Surrey. That's 34. They take Delta South and Richmond. They're at 38, 39. And then it's small ball to get to 47. It's maybe Maple Ridge, maybe it's Coquitlam, Westwood Plateau, maybe it's 1 or 2 in Vancouver, maybe it's 1 or 2 in the North Shore, maybe it's 3 or 4 in the island. But they have to come in like a wave from the interior and the south of the Fraser, and then strategically pick off seats in those other regions. That's my reading of it. And, there's been various seat models done that extrapolate based on, because there's no BC Conservative history to look at. You can't do a riding to riding comparison from last election. It just doesn't work. So if you're kind of working with federal results or NDP results provincially, that's kind of what it shows you. There's certain ridings that are on the table for the Conservatives that would not have been on the table for the BC Liberals, because they're like, say, north of Victoria, where it's more rural and non-diverse. It's very Caucasian. Those areas may well go Conservatives. There's some underlying issues there too on crime that are driving some anti-government sentiment. But there are other ridings that the BC Liberals would win that aren't available to them because they may be a little more urban and just have different dynamics. So that's my geographic take on it.
Right. Geoff,
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I think that, and I'd be interested in Mike and Kate's reaction, but say a guy like, even this morning on the radio, a veteran BC Liberal and a widely respected politician in the Northeast, which was never been NDP territory, Mike Bernier, says he might run as an independent. And Mike says, well, what was Kevin Falcon's pathway? My assumption was for some time that he was going to do an Andrew Weaver approach, which is what we saw. Weaver was head of the Green Party in 2017. If Falcon had only been able to win 3 to 4 seats, which was not out of the question, with some of the incumbents he had who were veterans, he might have held the balance of power. And Corey Tanaik, your colleague, wanted Kevin Falcon to die with dignity. That would have been pretty dignified. And it might have turned into a real kind of king-making proposition for him in terms of the future structure of the Conservative Party. Because there are, as you say, all of these very tricky ridings. I think that for my NDP friends in the Fraser Valley, it's going to be a tough go. There's a very strong, conservative culture out there. Surrey will be a madhouse, I think, because there's a lot of disaffected people who thought they were going to be candidates for somebody or other who no longer are, et cetera, et cetera. I agree with Mike on the island. Vancouver's probably pretty safe for the EB team and the urban areas. But there's some other areas too where it's just impossible to know because the candidates
What
will
about
be
this
unfamiliar.
fight for the working class, Geoff, that's going on?
Well, that's a really great question. I don't think that Rustad has nearly the credentials that Poilievre has built up, and I would, we can talk some other time about how valid those credentials are. But there's been no effort made by the Conservatives to do that. And some of the most overtly anti-union people in the province were part of the background group telling Kevin Falcon to shut his mouth and get out of the House. The Independent Contractors and Business Association.
But they know that Conservative brand, though, Geoff. They know the Conservative brand, and that's what Rustad's surfing on.
Yeah.
Well, the thing for Rustad, I think the interesting question is that the province has had a history, and Mike's familiar with it. I am. Kate's getting familiar with it, about the willingness of important leaders in the economy to sit down and make very, very hard-ass decisions about what's going to happen on the right-hand side of the spectrum and call those shots. Yeah. And they did that in this case. What is it that those people wanted from a Conservative formulation that they would never get from the NDP? Because even though I've lived here almost all of my life now, I still find it bizarre to hear people say that the only issue, defeating the NDP is absolutely the only existential question around. There's a few other things voters are thinking about.
I think there's a lot of disquiet about the results of the NDP government. And I think that's driving it. I think the increasing
let's get to policy in a second. I want to get to policy in a second, but first, I want to pull on something that Geoff said. Kate, how different is the BC Conservative Party from the BC Liberal Party?
I thought you were going to ask me how different is the BC Conservative Party from the federal Conservatives, but
no. How different are they from BC Liberals?
That very different. Because first question, not so different. Second question, very different. And I'll give you an example. I think, so that it's important to understand some of this wild 2 years hatches out of originally John Rustad getting kicked out on social media, basically casting doubt on the idea that carbon emissions are tied to climate change, right? And that was really Kevin Falcon, doubling down and saying, we're centrist. We're not right. We're centrist. And then the next move is Bruce Banman, who I think it's a few months after John Rustad in 2023 moves to become a Conservative. Bruce Banman joins him. And one of the things he says is he resents being told how to vote. And in particular, he didn't want to vote in support of, I think it's like decrying the Freedom Convoy.
Yeah.
Right. So like this coalition that moves over really is a repudiation of the center. It really is a group saying like, we're kind of done pussyfooting around some of this stuff. We have some stuff we want to say that's really more hardline right. And so, you can see it a bit. I know we're going to get into policy in a bit, but I'll say what we know about John Rastad and his policies is he's been really clear about like how he wants to end the indoctrination that happens with children in schools, right? That he wants to take out references to SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity, and to climate change, right? And just, again, for context, the BC Liberals had...
Math. How does he feel about math?
Oh, yeah, back to basics math. Oh, God, don't even. I have scars from that debate. But he hasn't covered that yet. But he... I think it's just important to say, too, for listeners elsewhere in the country, I know the BC Liberal brand in BC has historically been a bit different, say, from the federal Liberal brand, and a bit more of the right, but certainly definitely a centrist party that had a lot of federal liberals within it and brought in the carbon tax, for example, right? That it really kind of played to a bona fide a center. And the BC Conservatives are not that. Well, I think one of the most important things to watch in BC after this election is what becomes of this new BC Conservative Party, because there's going to be, I think John Rastad, if he wins this election in the fall, will look back on the election period as the easy part of the whole thing.
Guess, it's September, and that means 3 things. 1, we are officially in the final days of the BC election countdown, but I doubt I have to remind any of you hotel regulars about that. 2, baristas across the country are reaching into the back of the cupboard for bottles of pumpkin spice simple syrup. 3, it's back to school season. For some families, this season is a fun time to pick out a new backpack or lunchbox. But for many, it's a stressful time when the cost of classroom essentials can really add up. Presenting sponsor TELUS believes that every child, regardless of their financial situation, should start the school year with confidence and the tools they need to succeed. The TELUS Kits for Kids program helps make that possible, providing essential school supplies to children and supporting families in need. Each backpack is filled with a pencil case, coloring pencils, HB pencils, blue pens, erasers, a flexible ruler, exercise books, and loose leaf papers. Since 2006, TELUS has distributed over 225,000 kits for kids across Canada, ensuring kids have the supplies they need to be successful. This year alone, they've helped 20,000 kids succeed with these essential supplies. To learn more, visit telus.com/kits for kids.
Mike, I know that, you were managing a coalition in the BC Liberal Party and you had these Conservatives and you felt you had other people too. But when we had just had an experiment in real time. And so a year ago, the BC United were at 35 points, roughly. And today they're at 0. And I don't see any of those 35 points having gone to the NDP. So were all of the BC Liberal voters really also just Conservative voters?
Most of them. The ones that have left, obviously. Really all that was left at BC United at the end, as I said earlier, were just the holdouts, or the ones that needed permission to go, that were loyal, but will go to the BC Conservatives now that they've got permission. So, as I said earlier, it's a bit of a wash. But
permission is a very kind word.
So there's no third
neon sign and exit here.
I think
there's
people
no sort
wanted
of third
to know
of the old. No sort of third of the old BC Liberal coalition that would have chosen the NDP over a hard right Conservative option. Doesn't appear to be the case.
There are some for sure, especially in the city here, that will go NDP unless they have an option. And there's a lot of chatter right now in federal Liberal circles about running independents and having an option in ridings like Quilchena.
Always effective.
Well, in a riding like Vancouver Quilchena, I wounn't rule it out. Because they've got a tradition there. That's John Turner's. That's Quadra, right?
Right.
But but writ large, it's where everyone's going to their opposite sides. But this is what's changed here. Is that this is the first election I can think of in BC where federal politics have really changed the frame provincially. And what's happened federally in the last few years with Justin becoming more unpopular and Poilievre coming on strong, and as Kate said, they feel emboldened And if Poilievre running over 40% here federally, they're trying to get all that in the provincial Conservatives. And
he's close to 50. And it's not just Trudeau who's in the tank in BC. Singh is in the tank, and the federal NDP are in the tank in BC. So I was going to ask you about the role of federal politics in this, because it's not just that the polls are bad for the Liberals and NDP and the polls are good for Poilievre. It's also that, like nowhere else in Canada, Poilievre decided really in BC, to my eye, and tell me if I'm wrong, to run against Eby more than Trudeau. To single out Eby, take policy issues on, fight Eby on those issues. And to my eye, he's overwhelmingly won them.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up, David, because you and I also have shared battle scars from an election in Ontario in 2018 after federally things had flipped Liberal and a Liberal government in Ontario getting trounced. And, it's this thing in Ontario we talk about that, like, there's kind of this, like, one response to the other. Whoever holds power in Toronto will kind of respond to whoever's in Ottawa, and they kind of need to be in contrast. And no one really understands why. Right? Like, it's kind of just this thing. We don't get it. You would know this better than me, David, but I think we don't really know why. Here's the interesting thing about this, because I've been watching this whole time and, like, this feels really familiar, and it's happening in a Victoria-Ottawa dynamic. And I keep wondering if this is a bit of a symptom of a shift of how people consume their political news, because if you go historically, there was a much more of a geographical link to what you were consuming. So in BC, you'd probably be reading The Province and the Vancouver Sun, right? And in Ontario, there was more kind of alignment in Ottawa and Toronto with the Toronto Star predominantly. And then same thing with the networks, right? Because CTV is the big one out there. Anyway, my point is, as our consumption of political news moves online, it becomes more national and less regional. And so I'm wondering if BC is the canary in the coal mine, where the effect of Ottawa becomes even stronger on the political capitals and how voters express their dissent in particular.
There's a second, I agree with this line of discussion. I don't think it's worth bearing down on, but the very interesting thing happened in the leadership race that made Kevin Falcon the leader of BC United, as it later became, which was that they vetted out a guy named Aaron Gunn, who's an alt-right journalist from North Island, a huge social media following, can be a pain in the neck, but is very effective in terms of identifying issues about things being broken or drugs or whatever. And was very quickly picked and accepted federally as a candidate in North Island, where he has excellent chance of being successful. So a second person who left BC United was Falcon's campaign manager. I believe it was the manager, but named a guy named Karim Alam, a very skilled political operative, who then went on to lead the campaign for Ken Sim to become the mayor of Vancouver, but is disaffected with both of them, has been critical of both of them for various reasons. And so big chunks of what I would call mainstream conservative opinion became frustrated with the BC Liberal/United piece. And for all of those reasons...
I thought BC United was being run by Hamish Marshall, Andrew Scheer's campaign manager.
Well, there was all kinds of people went through.
He was involved, no longer.
Well, there was nothing longer to be involved with, but yeah.
But if you're looking for a target in BC to build yourself provincially, then EB's the big dog. And you have a lot of people in your room now who are frustrated with the provincial scene and weren't able to get through the door at BC Liberals, BC United.
So open up because you know a lot about this issue, and let's sort of merge this into an issue discussion. And you know a lot about this, Geoff, and you write a lot about this. But how do the NDP reflect on how Poilievre took the safe supply, safe injection issue and just turned it into a cudgel to beat them with?
Well, just before I came on to do this recording, I was watching an interview that David Eby did with a podcast in the Fraser Valley, where he called that a heartbreaking reversal that he had to make on decriminalization. And was saying that part of leadership is showing the willingness to acknowledge a mistake, that you didn't consider all the options and that you had to step back. Just for everybody's awareness, BC decided with overwhelming advice from everybody, including the police chiefs, that we should decriminalize the possession of small amounts of narcotics. The police were mostly leaving people completely alone who had that anyway. It was in some respects making official what was unofficial. But the outcome was a massive amount of public drug use and a real worsening of visible street disorder. So suddenly David Eby pulled the rug on that and reversed it. But we see now, and this is, I think, a national phenomenon for Poilievre, he's going to move in, cancel the tax, axe the tax. And Eby so far has insisted he's going to maintain a carbon tax, which has been bipartisan ground ever since Gordon Campbell brought it in many, many years ago. And he's continuing on a harm reduction track, although much modified. And Poilievre is saying, well, this is all a crime and disorder. It's all coming from the wacko drug policies of David Eby. So it's advantageous for Poilievre, and it's interesting that he's decided to fight, punch down to the provincial league this way. It's a hard one for the NDP, but recently we saw the death toll flatten and start to decline a little. It also did in Alberta. I think some of the other big issues out there may be more problematic, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Mike, what do you read into Eby's inability to successfully fight Poilievre on things like the housing policy or safe injection sites or crime? Like it really seems that Poilievre is driving the policy debate and winning the policy debate in BC.
Well, I draw a distinction on a few issues here. I think on cost of living and crime, those are real hot buttons that are driving conservative support, and the NDP don't have a very good story on it. As Geoff was just saying a moment ago, the visible manifestation of safe supply and other things. I mean, leaving safe supply aside, there's a whole bunch of issues that go into what's happening on the streets. But over the last few years, encampments and other things, it's not just Vancouver. Victoria's got a terrible problem, Nanaimo, Kamloops, you name it. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of unease on that. On cost of living, number one issue across Canada. And the carbon tax is not a great flag to be flying right now if you're talking about affordability. Now, on housing, I would draw a distinction because I think this government has been seen to be active on the file and has been seen to be doing lots of stuff. It may not be working, but they're certainly out there doing lots on the social side, trying to make stuff happen on the market side, you name it. But it's just not working. And maybe nothing will work. I don't know. So the fourth one I'd mention, though, David, is healthcare. And that has typically been a big advantage for the NDP. I think it's still an advantage for the NDP, but it's getting chipped away by just this drumbeat of ER closures every weekend. It's like, here's another 5 that are closed. It's mainly in the interior of the province thus far, but a few have been creeping into the Lower Mainland and the island. And that's, boy, you talk about events, dear boy, events. If there's like a big ER shutdown in the writ period, that's going to be problematic. Do you know why they call it natural gas? In 1862, 4 years after the formation of the colony, the first gas-powered streetlight was lit in front of J.D. Carroll's liquor store in downtown Victoria. The Victoria Gas Company's new plant in Rock Bay was the source of supply. Back in the day on Vancouver Island, gas used to be produced from coal deposits on the island. The gas was known as coal gas or town gas as it was manufactured in town. Since then, a lot has changed. With the exploration of the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, British Columbia found gas that was naturally produced through geologic processes. This natural gas was more affordable than the manufactured gas and has come to dominate BC's gas system over the past century. Today, FortisBC's gas system connects over 1 million homes and businesses. And like the shift from manufactured gas to natural gas, our province's energy system continues to evolve. FortisBC is bringing us back full circle by looking at new ways to move our energy system forward. That means working with farmers, local governments, industry, and Indigenous partners to develop renewable and low-carbon gas projects right here in BC and elsewhere. FortisBC, energy for a better future and a better podcast.
One of the interesting things about how the Eby government's been leading in their kind of big get shit done era, and as the discussion moves more online, the vibe, the ads, the way that the Eby government talks about their record is in this earnestness. It's earnest. It's like, we're gonna get this done, and it doesn't play as well on social media or in kind of align with kind of current voter mood. Because right now the mood is more pissed, right? So I think it's falling a bit flat compared to like a Poilievre conservative, Rostad conservative, more like, look at these twits, like that's more the vibe. That's and I think that's some of why we see these weird voter coalitions.
No room
playing
for
out.
joy. There's no
No
room
room
for
joy. No, there isn't. And it's true. And if you look at sort of even the stuff they've done on housing, which admittedly probably is some of their stronger stuff, like I think housing is a big issue. If you look at Vancouver, most expensive housing market, especially relative to incomes, and really squeezing out sort of, you got to be a big millennial voters for sure, even reaching into Gen X. And some really convincing stuff on the Airbnb moves and the transit-oriented density stuff. But it's earnest. It's earnest, right? It's great, but it's not going to land and get the same traction, particularly online.
I think the interesting thing there is that the business community involved in housing, which is represented largely by the Urban Development Institute, has always been a supporter of the not NDP option until more recently. Now, it's interesting to see what role they play this time. But a year ago, the head of the UDI said he had no criticism to make of the government because it had done everything the UDI asked for. There isn't really a large stakeholder out there who will say, they should have done this, that, or the other thing. So I think the housing debate will be a bit of a wash. And as one of your guests pointed out recently, David, on a different show, you're walking on a razor blade here, because if you really reduce housing costs, you crush the equity earnings and pension holdings of all the other voters out there. Yeah, don't do that. So, real estate is a third of the economy when our economy is doing well. It's a big, big part of it. But on healthcare, the question has been very difficult for the government to manage because they have spent a ton of money with physicians for which they're not getting the payback they hoped. They've added a lot of physicians, and I'm already explaining, so I'm already losing. But what is Rusted going to do? It's very unclear from his statements, but I think it'll be fair for the NDP to say, well, he's going to privatize massively because he's talking about these non-government agencies, and so I suspect the NDP can prevail in that debate.
And so park that, and I want to ask just this one last federal question, Mike, which is, rumors are thick in the air that while we are recording this show, Jagmeet Singh is going to pull the federal NDP out of their confidence and supply agreement with the Trudeau government and finally break with that government. How much has that deal hurt EB?
That's a good question. Half the MPs.
I thought it was.
Half the federal MPs. Half the federal NDP MPs are from BC.
Yeah.
I think it just made me think as this came up this morning is like, are they doing this because of the BC election? Are they that concerned that Jagmeet Singh is going to be a millstone around EB's neck during the writ period if he's still tied to Justin Trudeau? There's actually a federal Liberal MP running for the provincial NDP in this election, John Aldig.
Right.
So I don't think it's been a big part of the political conversation, that linkage, although the Conservatives do use it as a bit of an attack line. But frankly, they've got a lot to work with on the provincial level without having to draw in, federal thematics here. But it's part of it, I guess.
Geoff, do you have a take on that?
Well, the relationship between the provincial NDP and the federal NDP has always been strained because many federal MPs felt free to, be the first in line to offer their criticism, whatever was happening here provincially. EB, I think, made the most of the relationship with Trudeau because there's a lot of money at stake, but he didn't get as much money as he wanted and was very frustrated at how much flowed for economic development to Ontario and Quebec and so on with the EV plants and that kind of thing.
Can't build batteries in BC. You can't do it.
Yeah, but there's other things. I think I don't think that the CAS agreement hurt at all. But I think that it's not clear what's going to. Well, I think the NDP is facing a loss of at least half the seats here, unless there's a change in outcomes very quickly. That's based on all the polling we see. And recently, I live in downtown Riding, and I learned that my federal candidate will be Avi Lewis, who, for those who don't remember, is one of the most sort of most vocal activists on the far left of the NDP. So.
Another way of putting that is that he's one of the most damaging things for the NDP that exists in Canada.
So can I take off on that for a second? So Avi Lewis's
please do, Mike.
Wife is his wife is Naomi Klein, right? And her sister-in-law is Christine Boyle, who's running for EB, who was endorsed by EB's wife. And there is that part of the left side of the NDP, which, in my opinion, pulls the NDP away from the popular mainstream. And Christine Boyle is a very successful Vancouver City Councillor, and she won a contested nomination. However, her politics, in my opinion, don't sell outside of the city of Vancouver. And Eby's got to walk that balance here and against that part of the party that's pulling him away from the votes he needs in the suburbs, frankly. And he's not John Horgan either, right? Like he's a different sales pitch to suburban voters, whereas Horgan, and to Geoff's credit, had a great appeal there, a great relatability there. And when I hear Abbey Lewis running for the federal NDP, all of a sudden alarm bells are going off.
He came with that mic. I didn't give it to him.
I was going to reflect that question back to...
You helped him bring it out.
Can we reflect that question back to David, though? Because I was going to say, like, we can find evidence for why maybe BC election is a factor in these rumors and a factor what the federal NDP do. But David, isn't there enough incentive for the federal NDP to get out of that without needing to think about BC right now?
Well, I think that they are having to think. I mean, they're going to lose a substantial amount of their caucus, as Geoff pointed out, and a big chunk of that's going to come from BC. I don't know how much they were thinking about Eby, but it feels to me that Poilievre has been linking Eby to Trudeau very much, and linking Eby to Trudeau very much, and that deal probably allowed that to stick a little bit with it. But let me stick with you, Kate, and flip and ask you a different question, which is new right-wing parties. We've seen this before. They come out, they have a lot of momentum, and seems like often they need an election or two to learn how to be a successful political party. So I'm thinking about the Wild Rose Party that looked like they were going to win 15 years ago or something like that, but Alison Redford beat them in a big comeback because they had candidates talking about gay people dying in a ring of hellfire and stuff like that. Those kind of comments coming out of their party. The Saskatchewan party in their first election against the NDP, Saskatchewan's more boring than Alberta, so nobody talked about burning gay people, but they talked about privatizing the crown corporations, which is all it takes to lose in Saskatchewan. So when you look at the candidates and at Rustad, are they likely to run a disciplined, careful campaign, or are they likely to be talking about all this kind of shit that can cost them the election?
Okay. First part, are they going to run a disciplined campaign? I'm going to say no, because there's too many newbies. And there's too many people who were brought in, particularly because they reject the center. So there's going to be bumps. There's no question on that. But let me offer kind of two pieces to what, and to your point too about, let's say they form government, what's that going to look like? And I'm going to say there's kind of two visions I can see for what a Rustad government in BC could look like. Because one, I'll say, and what I was picking up on earlier and saying how this would be kind of hard for Rustad, I think internally it's going to be really hard. Internally, like caucus management, what is the future? What is the id of this new party is going to be very difficult to navigate. And that I think is going to be the headache for Rustad. I'm going to offer that maybe voters will be kinder. Because I think we are in a place now, and I'm going to pick on the Ford government as an example of this, where, again, when you sort of move to a more social media-based consumption of your news, I think voters become more forgiving in the context that you can apologize and seem authentic. Like the electeds who can kind of be like, shucks, whatever, will actually get forgiven a lot. And I think, in Canada right now, I think Doug Ford is probably our best example of that because he's had some pretty epic scandals and they just don't stick. And even,
it's because he so often looks like an observer to his own government. We did that? I can't believe we did that. That's terrible. I'm going to stop that.
Oh, exactly. Well, and let me to double down on it, completely. And to double down on it, I think part of why that works and part of why I say earnestness, like I was talking with the NDP, earnestness doesn't work because then you seem calculated, then you seem intellectual, then you seem like you've got these big ideas. You can seem a bit more hapless and get away with a lot more because they're like, well, geez, he didn't get it, but his heart's in the right place. And it's a very different thing and a very different discussion than what we've had historically. So this is my, if we have a Rustad government, his challenge is going to be internal. And I think the voters will probably be more charitable than his own caucus.
But I think in the next 5 or 6 weeks, Kate, don't you think it's going to be it's a challenge for both Eby and Rustad to find the authentic projection of who they are. And
Yes.
it's probably better to be an earnest person who really seems to have my interests and be concerned about it than to be, the wagon master in a stampede of people who have a whole bunch of different opinions and basically just arrived. I think the struggle for Rustad will be to communicate that he actually is a government in waiting.
No, that's a fair point. Yeah, no, and I was going to say, because, well, just to pick up, because Rustad on socials, like, I don't know, like, just like, David, I would love to invite your listeners who haven't enjoyed it yet. Like early on, when it became a party of two conservatives, John Rustad and Bruce Banman like did these great little like they're like the balcony Muppets, like these little whiny. But it's kind of like there's something I think that's workable in there, and I think a persona that Rustad could grow into that would work in that vein. But like Geoff is bang on in that like he's not nailed down what that could look like. So.
Well, look, John Rustad, let's just rewind the tape here. This is a guy who was in cabinet for 4 years. No one ever saw him as a leadership contender. He never put himself forward as a potential leadership contender. He's thrust himself into this role once he was, exited from the BC Liberals and found the Conservatives and took it over and ran with it. And he has been consistently underestimated all the way through. Even as recently as 3 or 4 months ago, BC United thought they could, had the upper hand in negotiations. So, I don't think he's changed. I don't think he has to change. His leadership numbers aren't great, but to me, the test for him is lower than Eby, who Eby has to go and basically seek a second chance from the voters as right track goes down, wrong direction goes up. Time for change goes up, and Eby's got to say, hey, I need another go here for another 4 years, despite some of the things you're concerned about. Whereas Rustad is just change.
Well, Geoff, does Eby have an answer to the question that Trudeau doesn't seem to have an answer to, which is, what am I going to do with the next 4 years?
We haven't seen him spell that out yet. And, I think that as the political landscape changes around the NDP, the question really is, well, how are we going to deal with some of these questions? If you listen on the healthcare front, Adrian Dix will say the closure of the emergency rooms is unacceptable. And, the average voter is going, apparently not, because we see it happening quite a bit. Right. And then to come back and say, well, we've got this many extra doctors and so on is not going to do it. So Eby's got a challenge ahead in the next period of time, partly to show who the broader team is and some of the ideas they have, but also to articulate what some of the changes will be coming down the road. On the other hand, and maybe I'm being defensive and the others will point that out, but I think the idea is that David Eby is a radical, extreme socialist who's ignored all of the lessons of the Horgan administration is ridiculous. I don't think he's a radical socialist at all. I think he's at least as centrist as Horgan was, but a very different personality. And so he has a double challenge. One is to find his personal connection with people, right on the heels of someone like Horgan, who was very gifted at that, but also to articulate what the province needs to do going forward. And more than we have to get housing affordability, we got to get the emergency rooms open, more than the small bore stuff, more of a visionary approach, I think.
So, Mike, maybe you can build a little bit on what Geoff was alluding to there. But my impression from previous conversations I've had with all of you is that Eby's a fair bit different from Horgan, both as a personality and character, but also in policy terms and the way he thinks about policy issues. And so we talked in the past about a slightly different coalition for Eby probably than there was for Horgan. And that was in the context of running against the BC Liberal Party when we were having those conversations. How does that different coalition and that different approach and that different appeal that Eby has, how does that play out in this new world of running against a hard right party?
Well, I think he has some advantages that Horgan didn't have. One of them is generationally, potential to appeal to younger people, although the poll numbers haven't borne that out yet. But as we get into the fray of the election, he may seem more relatable to people that are younger, who aren't angry, maybe. I think angry young people over housing are
otherwise known as women.
Well, yeah. Well, exactly. John Rustad's on Jordan Peterson's podcast this week, and that is probably intended to fire up young men right? And I think EB's opportunity is with women, and especially 55 plus women that are more likely to vote. And that's where Justin's last bastion, last demographic for Justin Trudeau has been 55 plus women. And so I think there's always been a gender gap between the NDP and the BC Liberals, but he might be able to widen it a little bit based on the tenor of the election and the issues that are out there. But I think some of that opportunity is constrained by, he has a more limited populist appeal, meaning the suburbs and outside the Vancouver area, than I would argue Horgan did.
Right. Kate, what do you think about that?
It's one of the most interesting things about the NDP right now, because I think you've had Geoff on your show to talk about the shift and the ethos of the NDP. And I think in these two men, we really have an embodiment of that sort of maybe more the past, maybe more the future. And I would have said, I was surprised and impressed, actually. I think I would have said when David Eby took over that the wheels would fall off the bus more quickly than they did, just because of how much, not a criticism of him, just how much he easily is an embodiment of that more elitist, progressive Champagne socialist. And for voters who aren't familiar with him, for listeners who aren't familiar with him, he's a civil rights lawyer who holds a very Tony, Vancouver riding. He's very much an intellectual. His brand is nerd. I think he's done a good job of kind of leaning into affable nerd. And I think there's a viability to that persona, but it's very different from John Horgan, who really he was a exceedingly relatable, very, very easily wore the kind of populist mantra. We've had another guest describe that as believably the guy who would wear Hawaiian t-shirts and throw darts. That is the measure of a populist or a non-elitist these days. But and so that has been, I think, initially went fine, but I think we're kind of seeing that maybe isn't holding as much to be true.
Well, in defense of the premier, I think he's a craft beer socialist, not a champagne socialist.
That is
Geoff,
accurate.
That's a good description. Geoff, do you think that the NDP at all considered breaking the fixed election date for the same reasons that Ford is thinking about going early? Because once Trudeau's gone, that changes the whole complexion of politics, right? And Poilievre and his operation will likely be immediately less popular than they are now once Trudeau is gone, and once that election has happened. And to the extent that Eby is the standard bearer in this election for Trudeauism, that would also be gone. They have constitutionally 5 years.
You mean to go later rather than earlier?
Later.
No, I doubt if
go
they
after the
that.
federal campaign.
No, I don't think so. Because the last time we were reduced to 2 seats, we had a zombie administration under then Premier Ujjal Dosanjh that went right to the wire, and it was catastrophic. So, I think the planning was always to do the fixed election date, and Eby...
You're not going to blame Ujjal for that election, are you? You got to blame Glenn Clark for that election. You're not going to blame Ujjal for that election.
Well, he was at the wheel. Glenn Clark had a big problem right before him, but I'm saying that going 5 years, is how do we finally get the tenants out of the house? That's where a lot of voters were. So, on the EB side, no. I mean, and Mike and I in particular talked about this a few times on the BC show, is that the EB was really, really firm about the first fixed election date because people thought he might go early. And, those of us who've been around those discussions would have probably looked for more flexibility, but he was very strong on that. He wasn't going to move.
Right.
Well, he was, and I would even say honorably so. However, if they do lose the election, you might have to find a new word, David. You've already come up with falconed. EB might be, you had a chance to win a big majority and you did what Gordon Brown did and didn't pull the trigger.
Moving it too
slow. I just want to tell a quick story.
You may recall that Paul Martin did not call an election immediately after winning the leadership. Do you know why? Do you remember why?
Gomery?
No. Because we were waiting for the electoral changes to come into place to give BC more ridings. We did not want to circumvent that process and be seen to be screwing BC.
How good of you.
Yes, yes. Tim Murphy reminds me of this decision from time to time.
How long was that wait? How long was that wait, David?
Well, we waited until June. And in between there, the Auditor General released her report on the sponsorship program.
Well, you got a few extra seats out of it.
We get people like us get very excited about things like eliminating the choices for voters and so on. But I was really struck many years ago, I've been shaped by it really, a focus group after the NDP debacle in 2001, down to 2 seats, which led to a really, really long, tough period. And we had focus groups of swing voters because a lot of so-called friends were telling us it was time to merge the Greens and the NDP to stop the Gordon Campbell Liberals. That was job one, which we hear a lot on the right now. Everybody else has got to put their interest second place. But the voters in the focus groups we watched said no for 2 reasons. One was we like choice. We actually think there is a difference between BC United in the current case. In those days, it was the Greens and the NDP. We think they're actually different, and we like the debate. We're fine with that. So you guys who want to force us to vote for one or the other, we're not keen on that outcome. The second thing was they believed, and I don't know if Falk could make this claim anymore, but they believed that the women who were then leading each of the parties, it was Joy McPhail for the NDP and Adrienne Carr for the Greens, actually had worked hard, had made a personal sacrifice to advance these ideas and thoughts. And it would be phony of them to merge because, this was not, they didn't share certain values. And I think there's an element there which will mean people stay home. They're unhappy with the way it was done. They kind of like the independent who used to be BC Liberal, or was it BC United, but was not offered a Conservative seat. And we're really not going to really know how this is all going to play out till maybe a week after election night.
All right, so let's wrap up this section of the pod with a quick round of what are you looking for in this campaign to tell you how it is going? What are you watching? Geoff?
Well, I'll be looking for strong, effective contrast between EB and Rustad on social media. What everybody here sees as negative advertising. I think it's important to do. I hope it's humorous. I hope it's fun. I hope it's substantive. I think it will be. I think also I'm looking for David Eby to start to talk about that larger vision he has for his second term, and to showcase more of the people in the team that he's got are very, very capable people who represent that generational change. I think those will be 2 good things to do. We'll stop there.
All right. Thanks, Geoff. Mike?
I'll be watching to see if the Conservatives are able to drive a unifying message around economic issues principally, but also crime, that brings a broader group of people behind them and allows them to set aside some distracting issues that may get under their skin, and see if the Conservatives are able to lift their boat up a little higher to get that time for change going. So that will be what I'm looking for in the next few weeks.
And Kate?
Yeah, closely related to Mike's, I think I'll be watching closely to see how John Rustad's personal brand evolves. He's definitely, he's just the unknown in this. He's not very well known. He's got good trajectory, but how that shapes up and how much that's formed, how much he emerges from arguably just riding the coattails of Pierre Poilievre, I think that's the thing that's going to let us know which way this is going.
Excellent. Okay. Listen, your team, you tend to end Hotel Pacifico with a drink.
Yeah, it's a good time. Yeah.
Are you going to invite me to have a drink, Kate?
Yeah. Come join us, have a drink.
All right. So we're going to the mini bar.
Yes. The idea. All right.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
Okay, David, welcome to the minibar. What you need to know about the minibar is pretty simple. It's similar to your Hey Yous and inspired by. The idea is that we like to raise a glass or take a shot at someone in BC politics who we think deserves some accolades or a bit of criticism. Feel good?
Excellent. I feel sounds fun. Sounds great.
All right.
You want to start, David?
Yeah.
Sure. I'm going to go, since I've been, going back in time, I'm worse than Mike in terms of history. And you got me all thinking about the old days.
You're not, David. You're not. That crown is thoroughly Mike McDonald's.
And in the context of this BC Conservative Party, which I expect to have all kinds of Looney Tune candidates attached to them, I would raise a drink to Randy White. Randy White from Langley, BC, who, with a week and a half to go in the 2004 campaign, and we were desperately trying to claw our way back, but it looked like the Conservatives were going to win. Good old Randy gave an interview where he said, you know what? We could give a fuck about the Charter of Rights. All those things that are protecting the Charter of Rights, we're not for that. We're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to restrict women's rights here, and we're going to restrict freedom of speech over here. And it was extremely helpful. It was extremely helpful. It may have made its way into some advertising. It may have cost Randy White any role he ever had in that party, but I found it extremely useful. So I have never had an opportunity to toast Randy for that. Thank you very much.
An A&W root beer. I like that.
There was some very intrepid opposition research that went into that, I hear. So I'm aware of people who did that. Not me, but others. I'll
next,
go.
Mike? Yeah.
Sure. I'll take a shot. I'll take a shot at the NDP here in BC for their initial sputtering response to the collapse of BC United and the deal with BC Conservatives. I think they're focusing way too much on process issues. I think they're lacking some self-awareness about some of their own deals they've done within their own party. The way, for instance, the Premier came to power was a bit messy. The way Selena Robinson was handled. They're going to go after the Conservatives for wacky issues, yet they've got vending machines with crack pipes outside hospitals. So I'd say, hey, NDP, focus on your issues that work best for you. Don't get ensnared by the Twitterverse. Focus on people if you want to win this thing, because right now, process issues don't get it done.
Yeah, well, I'm going to raise a glass to Mitzi Dean, who was... she had the worst job in politics. She was, for a number of years, the head of a Minister of Children and Families, which is a miserable ministry with a lot of responsibility for kids in care across the province, and was minister during a particularly difficult and horrifying case, which she was unaware of until it came out of closed court proceedings. And eventually was demoted a bit. She was not going to run. Then a couple of days ago, changed her mind and decided not to run. She's got some personal issues on the health side in her family, so she's not running at the 11th hour. But I just wanted to raise a glass to Mitzi because I know she cared every minute she was in that job. It was an extremely tough job. Everyone who gets it really does suffer personally and politically for it. And so I thank her and I wish her all the best.
Awesome. All right, I would like to
makes me feel cheap.
Makes you feel cheap? Oh, no, yeah. Usually it's Mike that does that. Like we'll go around and do shots, and like Mike will drop some like really heartfelt, like smart thing. But I'm about to do a version of that, and I'll invite you to join me in this one because actually I wanted to raise my glass to all the BC United staffers who now face an uncertain employment future, and I want to raise my glass in particular to those who are more junior, because I feel like it can be really scary, particularly in this economy, in this moment in time. You just end up at a loose ends for what kind of jobs are out there for you and even what the heck you want to do. And we've all been on, like all of us in this episode, we've been there, and we're here to say it's okay. There's life after political death. I don't know what to say. But and just to offer up to like, use your network, go have a coffee, like go reach out to someone and talk and commiserate, and you will figure it out. And I promise you will be fine. And I know it's scary. It sucks. So my glass is raised to you.
Excellent. But Kate, that there's there's one positive thing for them, which is that there should be 52 staff jobs open in Ottawa.
I didn't think you could walk by that one early. There was no way you were going to walk by that one.
Good point.
Talk about a soft lob.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for letting me into the minibar, and thanks for this conversation. It was such great fun, such great chat, and I'll be listening daily as you break this thing down. People should understand the sacrifices you're going to be making to get up so early in the morning to do these shows, to get them out by 9 o'clock. Oh, my. Anyway, you'll have a blast doing it. We certainly have in the past. We've done it in Ottawa, in Ontario, and federally. So, and there's nothing else like it on the marketplace.
All the staff at Hotel Pacifico are actually really looking forward to spending these early mornings with you guests just to talk more about BC politics and give this election all the attention it deserves. I want to thank David Herle for inviting us over to join him on the Hurly Burly. And I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS and Fortis BC. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Check out time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.